I want again to say good evening to those of you who are here in Washington, and good morning to those of you who are in Sydney or other parts of Australia. We're so pleased again that you've been able to join us. If you hear a puppy barking in the background, she really does not like me being on Zoom anymore. So I think it's time to get back to campus. So she's not distressed by that. So Ashley Click is not with us this evening. So I'm kind of running the technical side of things here. But I want especially to welcome our presenter this evening, Cristina Lledo Gomez, whom Veronica, who's named Koala this evening, is going to introduce to us in a few minutes. And Michelle Connolly, who joined us last week, is also with us this evening. So welcome again, Michelle.
Pleasure.
So we're going to begin with prayer. So Cristina, do you want to share your PowerPoint?
Sure, I'll do that. So the prayer that I'm going to use today comes from a good friend of mine, Glenn Lowry, who is an Aboriginal Anglican priest. He's an Aboriginal man as well. He wrote an Australian Eucharist, what he calls an Australian Eucharist, and this is the Thanksgiving prayer for him. So yeah, I invite you to join in the bits that are in bold. So we begin in the name of God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. God, you are with us.
We are never alone.
Our lives are open.
We know you are here.
And recognize you in all creation.
For this we are thankful.
God of holy dreaming, thank you for country, for the joy of being here and the possibilities of sharing in its wonders with others of all species.
For this we thank you.
We recognize your patience, remaining ready to welcome us back after we got lost in the bush. We welcome your gift of Jesus, your child, our elder, who lived for you so we too may.
We thank you.
Knowing blood does not cleanse us, we recognize his obedience to your tradition and language, which lead him to be unjustly crucified, opens the way for us to remain faithful to your way, the ways of our ancestors, your prophets.
For this we thank you.
We dance each day in celebration of his return from the world of the dead to you and to us, celebrating in the new growth in people of all ages, in the grass and trees, the eagle and the trout, goanna eggs and kangaroo pouches. God of holy dreaming,
we are uncomfortable with self-interest
and unaware of our rejection of others. Yet we are seeking welcome and inclusion, fearful of rejection and struggling to find our own place. Search for us, welcome us, give us, and bring us close. We pray, Jesus Christ, our elder. Amen.
Thank you so much, Cristina. It's just a beautiful prayer with beautiful images. So again, I welcome my friend Veronica Rosier, who has been helping to coordinate this Australian series with us. And so Veronica, hello. And I would invite you to introduce Cristina.
We are having today Michelle introduce Cristina. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Look, those of you who are teachers know that every now and then in your teaching life, you will get a live one. You know what I mean. And Cristina is one of mine. I've had a few. I taught Cristina as an undergraduate and then in postgraduate studies at the Catholic Institute of Sydney in Strathfield, and she was a shining light. It was obvious that she was going somewhere. She was a young woman without a lot of support who couldn't not do theology, I think is really what it came down to. It didn't look all that promising, still really in Australia, it doesn't look all that promising as a career option. She'd probably have a much better financial situation if she had just stayed as a maths teacher. But she chose the more difficult path. I tell a tale on Cristina to say that when she was pregnant with her first baby, she became very interested in what it is to be a mother. And this was very pressing for her because she was trying to find out, as a sincere young Christian woman, how to be a mother. And she complained to me quite vigorously one day in my office that there was just nothing. She'd looked, and you know, anything that she found that was Christian, it was really pretty pathetic. It was very, very inadequate. And she knew enough theology, and she just was bright enough that it just didn't satisfy her. So she began a path of trying to understand how to be a mother, how to be a Christian, how to be a Catholic mother in a way that actually brought her alive, and in a way that made sense to her and to all that she was learning. That's my way of understanding Cristina, because I believe that has driven her. And eventually, she began to work in all of these areas, feminist areas. Eventually, she did her dissertation at the Australian Catholic University and wrote a dissertation that ended up in her book, which is The Church as Woman and Mother. Cristina has then gone on from strength to strength. She is a star on the rise. This is a name to watch. So Cristina, you know, as a young mother with 2 children, married to a husband who's a deacon in the church, can I paint a picture for you? Nevertheless, has managed. It's not easy in Sydney, really, for example, just to find work. It just isn't. I'm occupying one of the best seats, although it's biblical. So they're probably all waiting for me to die, because that's what happens, at least in Sydney. If you want a job, you either have to assassinate somebody, and if somebody leaves or dies, then an entire department in theology can die. Anyway, so Cristina has been extraordinarily resourceful and limber, and ready to move wherever she could find opportunity. So she's actually very experienced in Sydney, ecumenically in theology, because she has taught everywhere. She has worked in church agencies, and she could tell you lots of stories about those things. You know, she has learned feminism on the road. She really knows it. But she has not just, you know, rested on her laurels. Cristina won an International Fellows Initiative, and so had a postdoc in Boston in 2015-16. She is very active in presenting in annual conferences. In the US, I will just mention a few. She's presented for the CTSA, she's presented for the Academy of Religion, she's presented for Boston College and for Georgetown University. She's presented in Rome, so they do know about her in Rome. And she's presented in the US. Here in Australia, she has spoken to the Australian Catholic bishops, so they have no excuse because they've heard from Cristina, right? And for a number of other agencies. She organises conferences. In fact, we're probably just catching her in between sessions of the current CTSA, where she's organising matters there, particularly for the underrepresented ethnic and racial groups. It goes on and on and on. She reviews for significant journals. She has, you know, a page full of upcoming publications, in quality publications like SCM and Mary Knoll, all sorts of publications she's working for. She's speaking on Mary, on child sexual abuse, on, excuse me, deleted and reclaimed borders. Cristina is claiming her own Filipina tradition. And in particular, I have learned a new word, which is babaylan, which I have discovered has to do with, it's an indigenous Filipina practice of healing, shaman type healing. So Cristina is investigating that newly, and in 2024 she has a book called BBI-The Theology from Australia coming out, which will explore all of those things. So Cristina's mind is ranging across a range of things: feminism, post-colonialism, her own Australian Indigenous theology and spirituality, and her own Indigenous Filipina background. Because of all of those things, she really is coming to notice, and I can give you a scoop that it was announced at this year's CTSA conference that Cristina won last year, was awarded the Catherine Mowry Lacuna Award for New Scholars for an essay called Mother Language, Mother Church, Mother Earth. So language, church, earth, and mother. That's what Cristina is going to speak to us about this evening for you. And I won't go into that because she's going to tell us that. So sit back and listen to a wonderful mind giving us the benefit of the wealth of her understanding. I'm very proud of her, in case you didn't pick that up.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that very generous introduction. And as you can see, she's a proud teacher and supporter, and I'm so glad to have her support. And it is true, it's very hard in the Australian society to even mention the word feminist. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, we make our way through. So I want to begin. Oh, and first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you find something to cling on to in this presentation today. So I want to begin with, the question why the church is a woman and a mother. Well, Michelle's already said it. Because I was a mother, I thought it curious that the church was called a mother. And as I investigated, did it connect with my experience? Of course not. Maybe just a little bit birth, but that's about it. Breastfeeding, protecting. But as you know, mothers and women are so much more than that. I've critiqued this image using, looking through the church documents, early church fathers, Vatican II, Pope Francis, using philosophical and psychoanalytic perspectives as well, particularly the maternal theorists, Sarah Ruddock, Andrea Dean, which is not the Andrea Dean who's speaking next week, it's another Andrea Dean, and Nancy Chudrow. So if you're interested in this area, those are some key authors to look out for. I guess my final thesis at the end of this is that, it's this idealized image. It's an infant's perspective of the mother who simply births, breastfeeds, and relegates women into baby-making machines, as as I poignantly portrayed actually in The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie. Yeah. So women have been used from ancient times for the agenda of men, and this is what I found, and I'm sure you have found as well. Whether it is to portray cities, to demonize female leaders so that people grew to trust male Christian clerics. This is what I've found in my own Filipino tradition, particularly with the Babaylans of my country, the Philippines. Women have also been used as figures of comfort in times of distress, such as the image of Mary, Mother Church, and even before the major world religions appeared and civilizations created statues of women with huge bellies and hanging breasts. For a long time, maternal theorists have spoken of the mother that appears for our comfort and our benefit, but is ignored in her hidden labor, and also ignores her as a person with her own needs, desires, destructive possibilities. Society only wants a placid mother who endlessly gives of herself to us. And this certainly plays out within the church and church documents created for centuries by men who project their own idealized image of women and mothers to serve their interests without consultation of real mothers and real women. So I will deliver this paper in 3 parts, taken in part from my book, but also the new areas of interest for me, which is the intersections in Indigenous mothering and Christianity. Part 1 is how the metaphor mother has been used in the church, an idealized picture of women. Part 2 is how Indigenous mothering shows what is missing from the picture of mothering and how Christian colonizers had a part in dismantling support for women and mothers and demonize them. And the last part is how the hierarchical church might begin to see women differently and come to respect them by being drawn more and more into the wisdom of Indigenous peoples. So just a note on the word metaphor. Metaphor, as a reminder, is that figure of speech that it's used to make a comparison between two things that aren't alike but do have something in common. And like a simile, where two things are compared directly using like or as, a metaphor's comparison is more indirect, usually made by stating something is something else. So I literally took that off the internet, but that was just a reminder for you what a metaphor is. Janet Martin Soskis says that the metaphor, she says a lot of things about the metaphor, but she also says that metaphor is cognitive, and an indication of a good metaphor is if it is unnecessary to spell out its implications for the readers. Unlike a number of tropes such as simile, synecdoche, metonymy, metaphor increases understanding rather than concealing or acting as mere ornamental rhetorical tool, which has effective impact but no increment to meaning. Soskis says many things on metaphor, but one important point she makes is that the real test of a living metaphor for a community is its necessity and explanatory function for the community. Soskis says the commonality between the great poet and the great religious teacher is that both use metaphor to say that which can be said in no other way, but which once said can be recognized by many. So can we say this of the metaphor of Mother Church? Turning to part 1 of my presentation, I look now at the Vatican documents. In there, it says that the church is imaged as a mother, sometimes implicitly, at others explicitly, such as Mother Church or Mater Ecclesia. The councils previous to Vatican II also imaged the church, all the way back to the First Council of Constantinople, circa 381. Before this, early patristic writers referred to the church as a mother, beginning with Irenaeus. Some even argue that the biblical texts, Galatians 4:26, 2 John 1, and Revelations 12, form the foundations for this maternal ecclesial imaging. The maternal metaphor's long history is evidence of its adaptability and ability to express the nature of the church through the ages. But can the metaphor continue to have relevance today and assist in understanding the church's nature, given that the contemporary understandings of motherhood resist any singular and culturally specific notions, especially from the dominant Western paradigm? Or has it become a dead metaphor, a cliche stripped of the web of associations that were originally evoked? If the metaphor's utility remains a possibility, what understanding of the church would it communicate? Moreover, what understanding of women does it use to communicate? Does its uses communicate? For the popes and councils who have used the mother language, there is a dissonance between reality and conceptualization. And I've argued elsewhere that it is due to these men often speaking of motherhood from the perspective of a child. Due to their celibacy, the primary experience of women for many of the clerics are their own mothers before they entered seminary and priesthood, often at a young age. And that is, they can only speak of motherhood as they have been or wish to be mothered. But this, the perspective of a child, is very different to the perspective of a mother. As maternal philosopher Sarah Ruddick says, to a child, a mother is huge, a judge, trainer, audience, and provider whose will must be placated. A mother, in contrast to the perception her children have of her, will almost always experience herself as relatively powerless. In the best of social systems, she is beholden to the workings of nature, whose indifference, most poignantly evident in illness, death, and damage to a child or his or her closest loved ones, can frustrate her best efforts. While children perceive their mothers as powerful, mothers may themselves feel powerless to various external factors, as I've just, as shown by Ruddick in her quote there. Ruddick further explains, from a mother's point of view, maternal powerlessness is very real indeed. Yet adults are not hallucinating when they remember their mothers as having immense power over their physical activities and emotional lives. A mother dealing with the daily exigencies of her own and her children's lives may not feel powerful. There are many external constraints on her capacity to name, feel, and act. While a mother can feel quite powerless to external factors beyond her control, Ruddick also argues that even the most powerless woman can experience an element of power. She feels her power in being in charge of the organization of her children's lives. She will teach them what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. She will show what is worth crying over and what requires little of their attention. She will expose them to what she believes is important and hide from them what she believes will do little, if any, good in them at all. There is then in mothering both power and powerlessness, and such complexity is not necessarily communicated in the image of a mother who simply births, breastfeeds, and endlessly gives of herself, as we see in the church documents. So what we see instead is the Catholic tradition continually elevating an idealized childish conception of motherhood as the epitome of perfect womanhood. I give the following evidence as examples. In 2013, on the 25th anniversary of the promulgation of John Paul II's Mulieris Dignitatem on the dignity of women, Pope Francis reinforced the special role of women as mothers, wherein they are called to a special entrusting, as also expounded in Mulieris Dignitatem. Pope Francis says, what does this special entrusting of the human being to woman mean? It seems evident to me that my predecessor, John Paul II, is referring to motherhood. Many things can change and have changed in cultural and social evolution, but the fact remains that it is woman who conceives, carries, and delivers the children of men. And he said men, he didn't say all people. And this is not merely a biological fact. It entails a wealth of implications, both for woman herself, her way of being, and for her relationships, her relation to human life and to life in general. In calling woman to motherhood, God entrusted the human being to her in an entirely special way. Now, I don't disregard that women can mother, and through mothering, there's something about that changes them as a human being. But this special entrusting is what I question here. Then Pope Francis warns of two dangers, presenting a wider view of woman in his first point, but then reiterating a limited view in the second. He says the first danger is to reduce motherhood to a social role, to a task, which, though regarded as noble, in fact sets the woman her potential aside. So great, thank you, Pope Francis, for saying don't reduce motherhood to a social role. This may happen both in civil and ecclesial circles. And as a reaction to this, there is another danger in the opposite direction, that of promoting a kind of emancipation that, in order to fill areas that have been taken away from the male, deserts the feminine attributes with all its precious characteristics. So this is what I critique, and this is what a lot of feminist theologians critique, these special feminine attributes that we're supposed to have because we can mother. So while Francis rejects the devaluing of woman, he refers to special feminine attributes at the same time, precious and belonging only to women, saying woman has a particular sensitivity to the things of God, above all in helping us understand the mercy, tenderness, and love that God has for us. This is actually very much a reflection of John Paul II's concept of the feminine genius. For John Paul II, a woman is ordered to physical motherhood or virginity, and this in turn lends to her specific character. That is, according to Mulieris Dignitatem, paragraph 30, she is the one who provides to others a moral and spiritual strength. I can tell you now that my daughter will protest that because she will say her dad does that too for her. Further, John Paul II describes a woman as having a sensitivity to the things of God and contrasts it with a gradual loss of sensitivity for man. That's in paragraph 30, because of scientific and technological progress. John Paul II's idealization of the woman reaches its heights when he describes a perfect woman, saying in paragraph 30, the perfect woman, referring to Proverbs 31, chapter 31, verse 10. So this is, your example of proof texting, becomes an irreplaceable support and source of spiritual strength for other people who perceive the great energies of her spirit. These perfect women, he says, perfect women, are owed much by their families and sometimes by whole nations. So the general message from Mulieris Dignitatem is that it is up to women to save the world from itself, or more pointedly, to save men from themselves, because women have certain beneficial characteristics that belong solely to their nature, because by their biological makeup, they are essentially mothers. Given that's what's happened in the pandemic, yes, we've seen women stand up and do better than their male counterparts. But anyway, contrasting that with Indigenous mothering. In Indigenous mothering, this picture of women as mothers birthing and nurturing exists as part of their collective and ancient wisdom, tried and tested for centuries. Indigenous women are seen as mothers, whether biological or not. And the act of mothering can sometimes be a synonym for parenting for the Indigenous communities, such that both men and women join in this act of mothering a child. But there is a difference between the Indigenous view and this Catholic Church document views of women who see women essentially as mothers or potential mothers, called to simply endlessly birth and nurture everyone else like the Virgin Mary Mother Church. Even when they can't physically birth. So I'm exploring this in this second part of my presentation in Indigenous mothering in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Just a note of caution, just as women can be imagined idealistically from the perspective of a child, essentially, or in the least potentially as good mothers, without, noticing their individualities and complexities, so can Indigenous mothering be imagined as like just this one image, not in their diversity. Devon A. Mesua, native woman of Choctaw Nation, explains that no one native woman could represent all Indigenous women. She says, because of vast differences in tribal cultures and personalities, in addition to identity issues, no one Indigenous woman can speak for all of us, she says, and it is not possible for any one feminist theory or thought to summarize Native women. Native women do share historic oppression, but the cultural, racial, and economic variations among Native women render any sort of national coalition virtually impossible. Our needs and wants may be similar, but they are not the same. But as Meshua points out, historic oppression is something shared by Indigenous women all over the world, and the expression of oppression set out below, what I'll set out now, will have resonances with them. Anishinaabe Kwe native Renee Elizabeth Mezinigizo Kwe Bedard says, the historic oppression of Indigenous women is a context in which they mothered in colonial times and the context in which they continue to mother today. A mothering that has been constructed within the context of control, conquest, possession, and exploitation. Its foundations is in white, male-centered Christian fundamentals. This was in the same way how white European colonizers saw lands and the earth as things to be conquered, possessed, controlled, and exploited. To the colonizer, the Indigenous mother symbolized the bounty and richness of the unconquered land they witnessed. Raina Green, descendant of the Cherokee peoples, in a parallel way explains the romanticization of the Indigenous woman of America on the one hand, and the view of her as wild and in need of taming of the other, paralleling the approach to rich unconquered land to be possessed and plundered. The indigenous woman was the familiar mother goddess figure, full-bodied, powerful, nurturing, but dangerous, embodying the wealth and danger of the new world, and therefore she must be controlled and possessed. This view of the earth and of lands as women to be possessed, tamed, and even plundered, depending on one's view of women, aligns with views going back to ancient times, when cities were also imagined as women, to be desired, conquered, protected, and governed by men. In conjunction, just as mothers could be regarded as endlessly providing nourishment, shelter, security, instruction, and identity, so were cities to be depended upon, to nourish, shelter, secure, and give instruction and identity to the people contained within it, within its walls. Jerusalem city in the Judeo-Christian story is a central character in the salvation history of both Jews and Christian, and this city is viewed also as a people and a nation in the form of a woman who, when good, was the loving mother or dutiful daughter, but when naughty, was the whore who broke the holy relationship, the holy covenant with a male merciful God who would purify her from her digression. That Christian mindset set in early patriarchal times has informed and continues to inform male abuse of females, both indigenous and non-indigenous, from pre to post-colonial times, exposing women to violence and justifying that violence, given it is modeled on a male God in relationship with a feminized people. When women are not good mothers and good daughters, they could be corrected by men in the same way that the male God reprimanded and corrected Jerusalem for whoring herself to pagan gods. And an example of that is in Ezekiel 16, if you want to look that up. But there are other examples. Whereas in the Western Christian context, women have been envisioned at the extremes, either as Virgin Mary or as Eve or Mary Magdalene, the seductress and whore. White male European Christian colonizers have conceptualized indigenous women also at extremes, either as earth mother goddesses, Indian queens, Indian princesses on the one hand, or easy squaws, virgins waiting to be won and conquered, over-sexualized temptational figures on the other. Bedard explains the manipulation of indigenous female imagery by white colonizers, aligning with the abuse of virgin lands and the exposure of indigenous women to vulnerability to abuse. She says, indigenous women's femininity was manipulated into erotic and promiscuous symbols. She became the icon of virginity waiting to be won and conquered. The equation of indigenous woman with virgin land, open to consumption and possession, created a dangerous archetype of indigenous women's femininity based on profit, violence, and men's pleasure. Bedard further explains her frustration at the perpetuation of harmful portrayals of indigenous women in popular culture. She says, currently, we are burdened with the over-sexualized projections that taint the images of our mothers, sisters, aunties, and grannies. I do not see the faces of the women who raised me in Disney's half-naked animated film Pocahontas or The New World, where Captain John Smith is portrayed as lusting after a very young Pocahontas. I am saddened and sickened that these images continue to be viewed by Canadians. These are not the role models of womanhood and motherhood that I want to see projected of Anishinaabe women. So what kind of mothering does Bedard then wish to promote? The view she presents aligns the woman with Mother Earth, who she describes as her first and true mother. She says, Mother Earth is cherished and honored because she sustains us with beauty and nourishment. Mother Earth continues to be bountiful, sustaining all beings. Despite all the changes that are going on around us, the earth continues to give life. This consistency is a promise to the future, to those yet to be born. She shows generosity by giving and giving to us. She is like our own birth mother, just as a mother gives birth to a child. Mother Earth nourishes her children, holds her child in her arms. She gives her child a place with her to live safe and warm. She may give birth to other children, but to all she will give food, care, and a home. Mother Earth remains whole, indivisible, and enduring into the future. As beneficiaries of their mother's care and love, children are obliged to look after their mother in her illness and decrepitude. The Anishinaabe ideology of mothering and motherhood holds that, like Mother Earth, we have a responsibility as women to foster and nurture the next generation and to allow others to assist in this process, such as aunties and grannies. So even though the mother here is pictured as being cherished and honored, it sounds a little bit like the idealization that the Vatican II documents present us with mother, like this endlessly giving mother who just births and breastfeeds. But Bedard actually provides the Cree-Metis woman, Kim Anderson, explains that there is a respect for the woman as a mother, and she is one seen as with incredible power to create and to nurture. But this is not understood as this selfless act of infinite giving. She says that there's a native principle of reciprocity, and that prevents this endless taking from the first mother, the earth, as she explains. If mother was to continue to provide, so the logic went, she must be nurtured in return. Life was understood to be sustained through cyclical processes of rebirth and renewal, in which men and women played distinct roles. Women had the power of menstruation. Giving birth was understood to be the sacred work of women, and this allowed them to act as intermediary between heaven and earth through their bodies. Further, puberty rites and ceremonies such as berry fasting offer an opportunity to instill a sense of Native women's power in pubescent girls. These practices show a real honoring of women and enabling them to grapple with their power and powerlessness in mothering and other ways that they are as women. Practices and beliefs steeped in ancient wisdom, which support women from infancy to adulthood and beyond. I mean, how great would it be if there were rituals for when we had our first period as women and when we reach menopause? So Bedard, in fact, speaks of principles taught to Anishinaabe girls to help them grapple with their power to birth as adult women, but also the responsibility and support that comes with that power. She says, Anishinaabe girls or young women are told about the importance of understanding and living the values of respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. The foundations of respecting a woman's ability to bring forth life with her body are vested in those four principles. But it was the introduction of a certain kind of Christianity, white patriarchal Christianity, into Native communities, which removed women's power and placed them in roles as mothers without context. That is, as women without support in ritual, beliefs, and community, in transitioning to womanhood, in existing as women, in existing as mothers. A woman was simply expected to be a mother who served everyone else abundantly and without end. Devon Miheshua laments the Christian conversion of indigenous peoples which served to disempower Native women. She says, among those who preferred to try and civilize the savages were Euro-American missionaries who pressured natives to convert to Christianity, which among other things included them accepting the concept of the male god and thus reinforcing the superiority of males. Kim Anderson further details the disempowerment of women by the introduction of the male god of Christianity in Native communities. She says, when God the Father took over from Mother the Creator, sin was introduced to Indigenous women's bodies. Menstruation became the curse. An illegitimate birth had the potential to be a source of shame. Ceremonies that legitimated women's life-giving powers went underground. Female spirits were considered evil, and women were no longer recognized as spiritual leaders. And I can tell you, like, this is my new research at the moment. For the indigenous peoples of the Philippines, the Christian colonizers actually introduced narratives of women as mythical creatures, devilish mythical creatures, so that the Filipino people would actually grow in suspicion of women and therefore trust more in the male clerics of the time. And the thing is, these stories are perpetuated. I grew up with them myself. So there was like the Aswang, the bat lady, there was the white lady, there was all these mythical creatures that I grew up with being scared of. And I've just, read this author who talks about these characters were specifically introduced to demonize women as leaders. So there you go. All of this shows there's much to learn from the violences enacted in the past upon Indigenous peoples, as well as on uncolonized lands. Native peoples could provide insight into how the world can heal from a type of Christianity which has at its foundations patriarchalism, patronism, power mongering, and a colonizing consumerist mentality. In this way, maybe violence against women could become unthinkable. Women could reclaim their worth as powerful in their ability to share in the act of creation, just like God. And women could reclaim their place as spiritual and community leaders, sharing the roles of leadership with both worthy men and women. Women and mothers will not only be respected in Christian ritual and teachings with their individual characteristics and complexities, but also be empowered and supported. In the same vein, the earth as a mother could be treated with respect and support, seeing her as a powerful in her ability to create and sustain life, but also caring for her as she undertakes the cycles of birth and death, the seasons throughout her lifetime. I don't know if I've gone over time already, but do you want me to stop or do you want me to continue? Anne?
Yeah, should we pause to see if there are any questions first, and then maybe you can pick up from there.
Yeah.
So feel free to put something in chat, or feel free to unmute or raise your hand. No one right now. If you see the curtain moving behind me, it's a 5-month-old puppy.
Oh, it's Michelle and Arlene that's put their hand up.
All right, so Arlene, and then we'll come back to Michelle.
Right. How have women's traditional roles in the church, as in orders in community, reinforced this male model of womanhood?
So how, let me just see if I got your question straight.
How have the women's roles and behavior in their own communities model this?
Yeah. Unfortunately, women are also guilty of reinforcing this, kind of 50s, 60s vision of woman and, woman in the home. In my book, actually, I talk about there's the cookbooks reveal something about how motherhood and womanhood in the home is kind of idealized, and like a woman could feel fully fulfilled in the home, and that's why she had all these gadgets at home. But unfortunately, women themselves have been guilty of reinforcing this good woman, good mother, does the right thing, supports her husband, and doesn't challenge enough this relegating of women to particular roles and not being allowed into other roles. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it continues to happen, and I think that's why women's orders are coming apart, and they're taking more individual leadership, which has been threatening to the Vatican.
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah. No, it's interesting because I think more and more as women become educated, do theology degrees, become aware of their own agency, they're starting to question and they're starting to challenge these, these roles that we seem to be boxed into, to serve society,
Michelle, you had a question or a comment.
It was really much along the lines of Arlene, about the risk and certainly the historical practice that women have often gone along with, the sort of male ownership of, that has operated particularly in the church. And so it, partly because in a way it was very, very difficult to resist. And also that for some women, it worked and gave them a great deal of power. And so it's not simply that if women are left to, allowed to, in a way, construct their own identity and image and ideal, that it will be an image and ideal that is liberating for all women. In my experience, it simply empowers a particular kind of woman who may be the kind of woman who likes to have male approval, who feels empowered by that, so issues even of, heterosexuality and homosexuality, I think operate kind of in the background of, if only women, if there were just a woman only tribe, would it work for all women? And I don't think it would. So I think there are really deep issues. Perhaps we haven't even named them yet, Cristina, that operate, I think, in, I'm inclined to think that we haven't yet discovered, we're only on the cusp of discovering what it is to be a gendered human being. I do think there's, almost feverish activity about that, but I'm always wary of, if women were left to themselves, well, it would be perfect. I don't think it would be. And I think, that TV show you referred to, the Margaret Atwood. Yes, I think that demonstrates, how some women can very easily be co-opted and become utterly draconian over their own kind to push them into a certain image. So that's another whole field, I think.
Yeah, and I also want to say too, like, as some of it's so tiring just trying to keep your head above water. There's so many things to juggle, and sometimes when women want to challenge, they're like, I'm just trying to feed my child here, trying to attend to my own self-care as well. I don't have time to deal with the crap from the Vatican, and I know I should, but I'm just trying to keep my own head above water. So I think that there's that aspect about it as well.
Cristina, I'm wondering if you could say more about how, drawing from the wisdom of Indigenous women, our Catholic hierarchy could look different. And I'm wondering if one way, I think about, I went to Mass on Pentecost and heard about how the church is always right because of the Holy Spirit. This wasn't Holy Trinity, by the way. And so is part of that idealized notion of motherhood as it applies to church, that she's always right, because when you're a child, of course, your mother's always right. But so would one change be that we could start to see the church itself as human, like a mother, flawed, not always right, and changing and growing?
So this was the thing, this was my third part of my presentation, but then I realized I was talking for so long and I wanted to invite conversation. But if I had the chance to say it, what I was going to say was, even though there's lots of things that seem to be not promising, for example, when Fratelli Tutti came out and lots of women protested and said, please insert Sorelli in the title of this document, and then that didn't happen. And then that whole document, you didn't have any woman that was quoted in the over 100 footnotes that was referred to. It seems like, there's no hope for women, but actually there is some hope. And this is my theory, that maybe, there's something about women that the Vatican, the hierarchy is having trouble connecting with, but they seem to be connecting with Indigenous peoples and their needs. And we can see from the synod on the Amazon that they were starting to take seriously, women and women as leaders, And if you look at the final document, there's actually some beautiful, amazing paragraphs there that make you feel hopeful about the Vatican actually taking seriously women's roles as leaders and decision makers. So in particular, paragraph number 44, paragraph 101, like look to there, and paragraph 102 as well, you know. There's this call for valuing of women, giving them a voice, recognizing their fundamental role in the formation of continuity of cultures, respecting their multifaceted work, that they are to be consulted in decision-making processes and even promoted to key positions in the heart of the church, including in positions of governance. This is in paragraph 101, valuing and respecting them, defending their rights. They actually use the language of rights, and recognizing them as protagonists and guardians of creation in our common home. Yeah, but then they talk about the feminine face again. But look, that's kind of promising. So I think that might be where the men start to see, or some of these men, not all of them, but some of these men start to kind of take women seriously as leaders. But yeah, as we see on that final document, that was promising. And then there was another document after that, and that didn't so much highlight the leadership of women. I guess Pope Francis wanted to present both sides, being Pope Francis and being into dialogue. He wanted to show both sides. I don't know if that answers your question. I could speak further if you want.
I think we do have some more questions, Anne, if you want to turn us to those in the chat.
So Nadine is asking, Nadine, feel free to fill this out if you like, about whether nuns in the tradition wanted to be nuns or were they given no other choice in terms of their role.
Look, there were certainly women who became nuns to gain their freedom. And Michelle probably, and Veronica will probably know more about that, you know, because they might have studied that more than myself. But yeah, a woman went especially in the Middle Ages, you know, she went to a convent because she knew she could get the studies that she wanted to do and have a bit more freedom and, you know, gain agency that way and not be relegated to baby making as a mother if she was married.
There's also a question about from Sue Blaine about whether you think the church's position on birth control relates to the metaphor of Mother Church.
Oh, look, I think anything to do with sex. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? Why does the church call itself a mother and then it insists on birth control? Isn't that funny? It's so ironic. Mother Church is continuously birthing, and but no, she's not allowed to use birth control. I mean, I don't know what's at play there. I'll have to investigate it further, but it's all weird and twisted when it comes to sex, and it doesn't make sense. And if you really take it seriously, then you would have to accept, you know, incest and you know, yeah, it's just all weird. I think that at the end of the day, there needs to be a development of a theology of sexuality, a theology that is grounded in reality, realities of women and women's lives and men's lives and their sex lives. So unfortunately, that's still, well, actually, it's developed quite a lot. But the problem is whether or not the bishops take those theologies seriously. That's the problem. So, and as we know, I think most people, most couples use birth control anyway. Yeah, so.
I have one comment. This is Erin. You had mentioned early on about the priests and the church and how they look at their mother in almost like a frozen frame of their youth.
Yeah.
And that, it'd be interesting to see more on that, because from my perspective, that's what I've noticed of the church, is that Christ also is steeped in that as well. Christ is a child, but the next time we see him after Christmas, he's on the cross dying as a man. There's no teenage years. And it would be interesting if they could get away from, if they could have a grown-up vision or grown-up version of their mother, because I think with that, they would also have a grown-up vision of Christ. And I think that would speak to a lot of other children. I'm totally single, have no children, but when you have a picture of Christ, literally as a child, he's not even presented in his teenage years. They show him presenting in the temple, and then that's it, but they don't even speak to that. That is really, really interesting and fascinating. And when you mentioned that part about their version of a mother not going past their youth, that just really says an entire lot, which also ties into the birth control thing and not having a mature vision of a mother or of women, literally. And I do agree with the other point that I think there are a lot of women out there who do understand innately that something is wrong, but like you did mention, even as a single woman, I have more than enough things to deal with just to make it through life. So to go ahead and take on this fight, you know, it's enough to know that there are other women in the church that feel the same way. So thank you definitely for your perspective, and thank you also for that comment, because that did tie together several perspectives that I had.
Thanks so much, Erin. I mean, just to take note, you know, like for a lot of them, these men, they entered the seminary before they, you know, turned 13, you know, they went into puberty. And, you know, a lot of their vocations were based on their mother's own desires. And so, you know, you've seen priests fall apart when their mothers die, because their whole vocation was based on fulfilling their mother's wishes. And so when they die, you know, what do they do? And so, yeah, the problem is when priests don't have good relationships with adult women and relate with them as adult women, rather than just seeing women as just mothers or potential mothers. I mean, look, it benefits them too, to just say women are relegated to motherhood, because then they say, well, that's their role. And then men, their role is they can't birth, so they get to be priests. You know, that also is working at that level too. But I think it works more on that level of, well, I haven't related with a woman except as a mother, and yeah, maybe my sister, but you know, if I have one, but not as women, as adult women who have complexities and their own needs and desires, but who also, you know, do the wrong thing, do the right thing, all that messiness. So thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
So Christina, I don't know whether you thought about this, but like Veronica and I think liturgically, right? And I think about our public prayer and both the use of the image of Church's mother, but then also just our ways of referring to our imaging God. And I wonder if you've had thoughts about how that might help change the conversation if we change our liturgical language.
Language and ritual is very, very powerful. I know that from experience, and I'll tell you two stories. One is, you know, sort of within the church context. I remember coming to a point in my prayer life where I couldn't pray. I couldn't pray to God, and I saw my I do supervision as a person who does ministry, and in a university. And this woman who's very experienced in chaplaincy said to me, but you know, why the blockage? What's your image of God anyway? And I said, intellectually, being a feminist theologian, I know that God is beyond all gender, and that, you know, in the Bible, we are presented with images of God as male, female, and so forth. But because of the constant language that I'm hearing, you know, God as Lord, Father, King, all powerful, all that sort of stuff, it's been embedded in me that God is this father, male figure that I can't relate with. And so she says to me, well, you know, what image of God can you relate with? I said, image of God is my mother, my sister. And she said, well, then give yourself that permission. Go ahead. And I was like, yeah, of course. You know, why didn't I think of that? And the moment that I started to imagine God as mother and sister, you know, my prayer life started to, you know, start again. You know, I was able to pray to God. But this is the power of ritual. I'm someone who knows intellectually that God is beyond all gender, and yet through ritual, this has been embedded in me. So that's my first story. The second story that I want to say is more to do with like my culture and my and what's continually perpetuated in my culture. So brownness is seen as inferior, whiteness is seen as superior, and me knowing that I'm Imago Dei, all that sort of stuff, I'm equal in everybody's eyes, I should know better, right? But no, only 2 years ago, I came to the realization that I felt inferior because I had brown skin. I actually admitted that to my husband. And I said, I feel ashamed that I'm telling you this, but this is what I've come to realize. And the reason why is it's because it's constantly perpetuated. God loved my mother. She's in heaven right now. I know she loves me. You know, she'd do anything for me. But every night she used to massage my nose so that hopefully when I grow up as an adult, I would have a white European nose and I would come to be accepted. That was one ritual that she used to do to me. The other one is when my aunts and uncles see me, the first thing that they say to me is, oh, you've been out in the sun again. You need to stay out of the sun. You have to stay white. As if it's, you know, this is possible. But these things continually get reinforced in you. And then, so this is the power of language. This is the power of ritual. So when I'm in mass, I have to work really hard to change the wording. So when I hear God is he, I change it to she. When it, you know, or they, or, you know, plural terms, or, you know, especially in the creed, why do we even need for us men in our salvation? So some churches I've seen drop that men bit. Good on them. Wonderful. Excellent. But yeah, more needs to be done. There's more diversity in the church. And why don't we celebrate that instead of referring to, and I'm not saying drop Father, Son, and Spirit. Great, keep it. But I'm also saying use all the other untapped metaphors, because we're actually missing out on the richness of the diversity of God who is. So there we go.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Leslie has a question that we can pose before we run out of time here. So it's about the recent reforms of canon law, focusing on 3 areas: sexual abuse, financial scandal or fraud, and the ordination of women. So as Leslie points out, the first 2 are crimes. Well, how do we get the ordination of women coupled with these other 2 issues?
Oh, it's appalling. It's totally appalling. I mean, I even found as well in my research that it was a crime. At one stage, it was a crime to let women go to work. This is in church documents. It was a crime to let women go to work. The document is Arcanum Divinum, Arcanum Divinum Sapientiae, if you want to look it up. But obviously that hasn't been referred to now. So my thoughts is that if that's not being referred to now, maybe this thing of women being ordained as a crime will eventually not be referred to. Maybe not in my lifetime, maybe in a later lifetime. But look, the church moves and it is moving, but it's moving at a ridiculously slow pace. It's like this wheel that's so heavy, and but see, the thing here is that we don't need to move the big wheel, the big whole wheel ourselves. We just chip away at it, chip in whatever way we can. And eventually, what did they say? The crack lets in the light. So is that that Cohen song? So just chip away. And also take care of yourselves. Meet with other women, have those rituals that have inclusive language, lead those prayers. Why do you have to just go to a mass that has exclusive language to get your spiritual nourishment? Do these things like this, which you are doing, and get your nourishment that way. And yes, challenge continually, just chip away. That's all we can do.
Yeah, thank you for that encouragement. Veronica, Michelle, anything to add as we sort of begin to wind down here?
Well, I want to come in with a liturgical follow-up there to what Cristina has said. I think one of the main things is to do a better collection of readings for a lectionary, which represents a more representative selection that introduces all those images of God, which we don't always hear, and of actual texts that refer to the way women have moved society forward and moved the Christian and Judeo image into its reality. And a lot of work, of course, has been done in making lectionaries that are like that, particularly in the Revised Common Lectionary, but also the 1998 US bishops who did the translation of the Missal, which has its collects are just so much more accessible and more rounded in terms of the language and the concepts that really reflect the scriptures better.
Thank you, Veronica. Michelle.
Thank you. I'm not sure who made the comment, but I was fascinated by the person who made the point coming off Christina's commentary about priests in particular who, especially if they went into seminary as they used to do as young, and they go. Here in Sydney anyway, they're encouraged if they can get them at age 18, they'll get them. And they say that the human brain doesn't mature until the early 20s, I believe. So, I mean, that's why, of course, all, total societies want to get recruits, straight from school as soon as they can get them, so that they actually do the final shaping of the human being in the nature of whether it's the army or whatever else it is. I was fascinated by whoever noticed that what we hear about Jesus, I presume from the Gospels, tends, if we get anything, we get the infancy things, which I think, amongst other things, I realise there's a whole field in this, but the child is kind of conventionally assumed to be like sexually neutral or completely innocent. I think that's not as simple as that. It goes from that then to the adult, and simply is not trammelled with any of the adolescent stages of Jesus. Just a couple of comments about that. It is only Matthew and Luke go anywhere near the pre-adult Jesus. I think Mark and John prudently just don't go there at all. They deal only with the adult Jesus. They say that in that ancient culture, they didn't, the concept of child development and then of adolescent development is very, very recent in history. It's only, we've only had it, Piaget and all that kind of stuff. We've only had it for 100 years or so. So the ancient texts are never going to give us that. The closest any of the biblical texts come is when Luke has one verse, I think, about that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature before God and human beings. And that's presented after the occasion of you know, the event in the temple, you know, when he was about doing his father's business, which is really theological. It's not developmental at all. So the scriptures are not a good source for us, but I do think we need to try to imagine Jesus more realistic. I mean, you know, if we take on the best of theology, whatever is not assumed is not redeemed. We have to, and now that we know about psychosexual development, for example, we need to recognise that process has to have been undergone by Jesus, with all the fallibility or whatever you want to think about it. That's part of the human being. You know, the scriptures are not going to give us a lot of help, but I do think that we have to reconcile what we now know and our Christology.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much for that addition.
Thank you. So we're at time already, and I just really want to thank Cristina for joining us. This has been just, again, incredibly fascinating and thought-provoking. Part of me, I think I want to watch and listen again, and then I think we need to have like further conversation and like breakout groups at Holy Trinity and so on, just to really unpack this. And I'm reading your book. I'm not quite finished with it right now, but I certainly recommend it to people if you want to get more in depth about this metaphor of church as woman and mother. So thank you for getting up early and spending this time with us. And thank you to Michelle and Veronica. So please join us next week when Andrea Dean will join us. She has a long history of studying the church, including heading up the Office for Participation of Women in the Church that was affiliated with the Australian bishops, but in the last few years is no longer. So there's a whole story there that we'll need to explore as well. So we look forward to your participation next week. So all of you in Australia, have a good Tuesday, and my friends in DC, have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
Thank you.